So to start off here with China's century of crisis, um, you want to put down here next to Roman numeral one. Just go ahead and put it over here on the right. And this is just a little bit of a reminder because it's been a minute or two since we've dealt with China. Do you want to put down here next to Roman numeral one that is China went into isolation as China went into isolation, Western Europe and other Western powers advanced. And the start of this here is really in the end of the 18th century, in the 1700s, when the Chinese emperor kind of rebuffed Britain's request that China rescind or loosen restrictions on trade. As soon as that doesn't happen, all of a sudden, the English in particular are going to get pretty froggy. And they're going to want to change trading terms and conditions um, by themselves and kind of unilaterally. And you'll see, and you should have seen, like with last chapter, is a lot of these places that the Europeans have contact with and are imperializing are places that they already had contact with. They're just kind of changing the terms and conditions of a pre-existing relationship. Because China didn't want to change those pre-existing terms and conditions, then the English are going to kind of do it on their own. Chinese authorities up to this point had controlled and limited European activities for centuries. You want to put down here next to number one that this had encouraged Europeans to find things worthy of trade. So, what's going on here, if you remember, because again, like I said earlier, it's been a little bit since we've talked about China. Remember, we've had forever this imbalance of trade between China and, in particular, Western Europe. That the Western Europeans are buying a lot of Chinese goods, but the Chinese aren't necessarily really buying a lot of European goods because they don't think that they need them. And the Europeans, to be honest with you, aren't really making anything of a high enough quality to make the Chinese interested in what the Europeans are pushing. So, because there is this constant trade imbalance, what the Europeans are very driven to do is to try to find something that the Chinese are interested in. Eventually, they do find it. It will be opium. And basically, the Europeans and also some US businessmen are essentially going to become drug dealers, but the Western powers will figure out something to change that trade imbalance that exists. Ultimately, here, and this is going to be at the end of this section, by 1912, the Chinese Empire had collapsed and became a weak junior member in the European dominated world. You'll actually see that they won't technically be thoroughly imperialized like some of the other places like Africa and other parts of the Middle East. Instead, they're going to be carved up into something a little bit different. And it's going to be more than just one European power coming in. It's going to be all of the European powers coming in. But how does China get to this point? To a large degree, and we talked about this before, it was a victim of its own success. It's experiencing a massive population boom where in 1865 we had a population of 100 million, and then, barely 2 centuries later, we've more than quadrupled that population to 430 million. But what we do not have here, which is what we had in Europe when we had the population boom going on at sort of kind of roughly the same time, is that the Chinese didn't have an accompanying industrial revolution. And this is going to be problematic because, and you want to put down here next to B, because of this, put it right here next to B, because of this, demand was high and production was low. Because of this, demand was high and production was low. So, what you're going to ultimately have here is more and more people are going to be impoverished. And if you remember back to chapter 16, poor people become angry and they become revolutionary. So we're going to have some problems within China even before the Europeans and the other Western powers come in. Coupled with this economic problem is the fact that the Chinese bureaucracy just simply didn't keep pace with the growing population. It didn't grow to keep up with the fact that we have more people. So the bureaucracy didn't have more government workers and didn't have more government services to meet the needs of the growing populations. Instead, what happens is that this Chinese central state gradually loses control to provincial authorities and also the gentry. What happens here is basically that the central power of the Chinese government is going to become fragmented because they can't take care of business by themselves. They need help with the provincial officials and also with the landed gentry. So they end up giving them power and influence, thereby kind of fragmenting their own power and control. Corruption, also harsh treatment of peasants, was endemic amongst officials. I mean, really governmentally, we're not on a good pace. The culmination of this is going to be one of the first of the internal crises, which is going to be the Tapping Rebellion. And this is going to go on for more than 14 years. It's going to last from 1850 to 1864. Initially, the revolt is going to be successful, and they're actually going to create their own capital in 1853. But ultimately, the rebellion is going to be crushed in 1864. Now, this is going to be good news because the rebellion is crushed, but the bad news is going to be incredibly detrimental here. So you want to put down here next to number 7. You want to put, please, here that the rebellion was not suppressed by imperial military forces. The rebellion was not suppressed by imperial military forces, which showed its weakness. Which showed its weakness. In fact, what ultimately happens is the resolution of the Tapping Rebellion is going to consolidate the power of the provincial gentry even more. Because what happens here is that it's these guys that ultimately are going to kind of take care of the rebellion. So ultimately, you want to put down here next to number 8, just go ahead because it's not a very big note. Just fit it right here next to number 8. You want to put down this further decentralized the government. This further decentralized the government. What it means is that the centralized authority is being fragmented even more, that the central government is losing some of their power to control the countryside because they can't, and they're losing it to the provincial officials. And then to add to these problems internally, we're also going to have some overwhelming Western pressures. And this is going to initially come from the English, but you'll see that ultimately here, everybody and their brother is going to pile on here. So the Opium Wars are going to transform China's relationship with Europe. Now, opium is not anything that's really new in China or actually in East Asia. It's been used for centuries, but in fact, it had been used by the upper class elderly as a luxury good, for lack of a better idea. Eventually, here, what happens is that the English start to sell large quantities of Indian opium in China. India winds up being a very good place to grow opium, not only because of the climate, but also because of the proximity to China here as well. The Chinese authorities recognize the dangers of opium addiction and try to stop the trade. What ends up happening here, and you want to go ahead and just put this somewhere here next to number one. You want to put down, and this will kind of explain why it's such a problem, besides the obvious that it's a heavy duty narcotic. But put down here next to number one, the opium trade destabilized the Chinese economy further by causing silver to flow out of the country to pay for the opium. So if you kind of remember the last time we talked about China substantially, they had just redone their tax system. So they had this major hunger for silver. So you had all of this silver coming in from Europe and also from their colonies in South America, kind of flowing into China. And this ended up doing some relatively positive things for the Chinese economy. But now we have just the opposite going, where instead of this silver flood coming into China, we now have this silver flood going out of China in order to pay for all this opium that's coming in. Because it's so profitable, of course, the European merchants are going to want to continue the trade, and they actually going to start to bribe officials to smuggle opium in. Finally, here in 1836, the emperor decides to suppress the trade. He goes absolutely, bonkers with it. He'll take whole shipments of opium, which at this point are kind of shipped in what look like small cannonballs. They're like these round balls of opium, about the size of a grapefruit, give or take a little bit. And he just threw it in the ocean. He would go, and anyone who was dealing or using opium, anyone he would find in an opium den, he would just have them dragged out in the street and executed right there on the spot. I mean, he had a zero tolerance policy. Because this was impacting Britain and these merchants so aggressively, they decided to respond with the first opium war here. What this forces people to do is it forced China to accept the free and proper trade relations among countries. What really is going on, you want to put this down here next to number two. You want to put, please, that the British saw this as a violation of free trade. You actually end up having the Chinese emperor going and sending a letter to Queen Victoria, basically asking her to call off the opium trade. And the British government kind of responds like, hey, you know what? You didn't hear us complaining about us buying all the silk and porcelain and tea and jade that we've been doing for decades and decades and decades. And we didn't have a favorable balance of trade with that. Now we've just simply found something that you guys want, and now you're complaining that you don't have a favorable balance of trade. I mean, it's semantics and it's sort of kind of nonsense, but this ends up being at least the British take on the entire situation. They were just ticked off that they weren't going to be able to make the money off of the Chinese. Ultimately, the war ends in 1842 with something known as the Treaty of Nanking. What I need you to put down here next to B underneath number two, do you want to put down, please, that this was the first of the unequal treaties? And put unequal treaties in quotes. This was the first of the unequal treaties. And then on the other side of B, because this treaty is really kind of a big thing, I want us to put the list of things that the Treaty of Nanking did. And you can just run it down the side because we don't have any other notes that will go down this side of the page. So it's really just a list here for the Treaty of Nanking. Do you want to put, please, here that China had to pay a $21 million indemnity? An indemnity is INDEMNITY. Minity. And what an indemnity is basically payment for loss in war. So because China lost, they have to pay additional money to England. And the second thing they had to do, they had to give up Hong Kong, had to give up Hong Kong. Third, 5 ports were open to trade. 5 ports were open to trade. And this last one is going to be a big deal a little bit later on, and I'll kind of, explain it here in a second. But the fourth big deal is that foreigners receive the right to live in China under their own laws, which was known as, and this is going to be all one word, and spell it the exact same way it sounds, extraterritoriality. Extraterritoriality. What it basically means is that if these Europeans, these Englishmen, are living in China and they break a law, provided that whatever law they broke, they also wouldn't be breaking in England, then it doesn't count. Like they can break all the Chinese laws that they want, provided that those laws also aren't laws within England. And this is going to be a big problem here later on, because obviously there's going to be, some abuse. And clearly, some Chinese are going to see that this is completely and totally unfair and jacked up. Eventually, here we end up getting a second Opium War. Um, Consequence of this is more treaties and more ports were open to foreigners. Western powers are given the right to patrol some of China's interior waterways. So again, they're continuing to fragment that central authority. China was also defeated by the French and also by the Japanese. So, like I told you before, it's not just simply the English that are coming in. A lot of other European powers are coming in here as well. Ultimately here, these unequal treaties, which all of these Western powers or Westernized powers are going to sign or force China to sign, are going to inhibit China's industrialization. And this is going to be important later on. So you want to put a star here by number 6. Now, the Chinese government just doesn't take this laying down. They do try to act against some of the problems, but honestly, it's a little too late. They try to do a policy of self-strengthening in the 1860s and 1870s. There's efforts to improve the examination system, which, to be honest with you, absolutely every single time there's problems in China, when we get rid of one dynasty and put in another dynasty, they work to improve the examination system, thinking that somehow that's going to be, the magic pill to solve all of it. There's also going to be an attempt to restore rural social and economic order, because these are going to be the areas that, of course, were the areas of upheaval during the Tapping Rebellion. Unfortunately, here, ultimately, conservative leaders are going to fear that development would harm the landlord class. So, because of this, you want to put down here next to number 2. And by the way, we're going to have another note next to 3. So, might want to put one side, one like the other side. But, it's up to you. But put down here next to number 2, because of this, reform didn't go very far. Because of this, reform didn't go very far. These conservative leaders are basically concerned that it's going to cheese off the landed class, and that the landed class would rise up and cause some problems. So they really just put the brakes on a lot of the reforms that might have been able to do something. They may not have been able to do anything, but you know, um, because of the sensitivities of the landlords, everything was sort of kind of pulled back on. Ultimately, here we're going to have another uprising known as the Boxer Uprising, where these militia organizations are going to kill Europeans, Chinese Christians, and they're also going to go after foreign embassies. Now, The group here known as the Boxers, it's actually a European name, and the militia organization honestly has like the best name ever. So over the side, you want to put down here, the Boxers are also known as the Righteous, Harmonious Fists. The Boxers are also known as the Righteous, Harmonious Fists. They're given the nickname of the Boxers because some Europeans, some Englishmen, see them training with martial arts and they kind of make fun of them, thinking that they look like they're shadow boxing. It's actually going to end up being some Japanese that find out what the plot of the Boxers are, and they notify everybody and their brother because they realize that this could be a really bad thing for everybody. So the Boxer uprising doesn't necessarily get the momentum that initially the Chinese hoped that it would. Ultimately, here, a growing number of educated Chinese are going to become very illusioned with the Qin dynasty, which is the dynasty in charge of China at this time. So they create organizations to examine the situation and also to propose reforms because we need to do, the Chinese have to do something more because, everybody and their brother are coming in and kind of carving out their own little sphere of influence. There's a growing drive for a truly unified nation in which people took part in public life, try to create this more of a team effort rather than kind of like some of the earlier reforms were concerned about the sensibilities or the sensitivities of the landlords. Eventually, here, this new form of Chinese nationalism is going to be fought against both foreign imperialists and also the foreign Qin dynasty. The Qin are not technically Chinese. They actually come from an area just north of China known as Manchuria. And if you remember when we were dealing with the Chinese and the Mongols, the Chinese are very ethnocentric. They're not a big fan and they're also very xenophobic. They're not a big fan of foreigners at all. Now, the government does agree to some reforms in the early 20th century, but it's not enough. Again, like I said earlier, it's a little, too late. And the imperial order is going to collapse in 1911. Then you want to end up here putting down next to five because it's going to be a little bit until we come back to the rest of the story for China. But you want to put here, please, that China will struggle internally until after World War II, until after World War II, when Mao, M-A-O, when Mao, M-A-O, and the communists take over. When Mao and the communists take over. And then, the issue is going to be something completely and totally different. But like I said, we'll deal with that in a later chapter.